Today, we will be teaching you how to add decorative stitching to your quilt binding. For this technique, you will need a quilt that needs binding, binding strips that have already been sewn together, a sewing machine with decorative stitch options, an iron, a thread of your choice. We will be using a few different wonderful threads in this tutorial, wonderful iron infuse, and additional supplies you may want are binding clips, a walking foot, and a zigzag or open-toed foot. These are not necessary but may help. To follow along with this tutorial, you will need to have already attached one side of your binding to your quilt. If you need instructions on how to do this or how to prep, measure, and cut your binding, check out our binding playlist, where we have videos that cover all the basics of binding. This playlist is linked in the description box below. We do have one tip for cutting your binding. This technique is a bit easier with a wider binding, so we recommend a minimum binding width of 2 inches for this tutorial. Another note is that for this tutorial we have sewn our binding to the top of the quilt, then added our decorative stitching over this seam, being sure to grab the binding on the back as we stitch. You can choose to stitch your binding to the back of the quilt instead, whatever works best for you. We will be showing you 2 methods for adding decorative stitching on your binding. The first method is adding a decorative stitch that can hold your binding in place on its own. The second method involves stitching your binding into place with a blind hem stitch, then adding a decorative stitch over the top. The first method we will be showing is just a decorative stitch. We will start this method by prepping the binding to add the stitching. We are going to place the quilt facing back up. You can see that our binding has been sewn to the top of the quilt already. We are going to use iron infuse to temporarily hold our binding in place as we stitch. Iron infuse is our 40-weight fusible thread that can be used to fuse layers of fabric together. It is a great alternative to pins or clips to hold your binding in place. All we have to do is stitch along the edge of the quilt with iron infuse in our needle. In the bobbin, we are using Decobob. We are using a zigzag stitch as this applies more iron infuse to the quilt, making it easier to iron into place later. Once you sew all along the edge of your quilt, pull your binding over the raw edge of your quilt and iron it down. The iron infuse will hold it in place. Be sure to fold the corners down into mitered corners like so. Squish some iron infuse into the corner and iron that into place as well. Now that the quilt is all prepped, we have to decide on a decorative stitch and adjust its length and width so it can effectively stitch down the edges of the binding. If the stitches aren't the right size, there will be gapping in the binding. We recommend to start with 1.8 inches for both length and width. Test the size on a practice piece of fabric before putting it on your quilt. Adjust the stitch, test it out, and make changes as needed until it effectively covers your edges. For our first stitch, we will be using Fabulux in the color Cloudy Skies. Fabulux is our 40-weight tri-lobal polyester thread that has a beautiful sheen. It comes in stunning variegated colors that highlight decorative stitches well. We will be using a blanket stitch, and for this stitch, the first 2 stitches, front and back, will be on the quilt, while the last stitch, or the spine, will go onto the binding itself. It should look something like this. As you are doing your practice stitches, be sure to plan out how you want your stitching to sit on your binding. The look, placement, and size of the stitch will depend on what decorative stitch you choose. When you reach a corner, the goal is to secure everything into place well. For a blanket stitch, you want to get the spine into the diagonal seam of the corner. But this placement again will vary depending on what stitch you choose. And that's it. Here's how the quilt should look and how the corners should look with the blanket stitch that we chose. There is an alternative way to add decorative stitching with the machine that gives you a bit more freedom in your choice of decorative stitch. You can also first use a blind hem stitch to sew down the binding. For this, you will need all the same tools, as well as a zigzag or open-toed foot, and a thread that matches your binding. We are using Decobob in black to match our binding. Decobob is a great thread choice for this technique since it is an 80-weight, low-bulk, soft, cottonized polyester thread that will blend seamlessly into your binding. We don't want to be able to see this stitch. You can also use Decobob in your bobbin. You will prep your quilt and binding the same way as with the previous technique, adding iron infuse and pressing the binding into place. Then set your machine to a blind hem stitch, which will look something like this, and put on the correct foot for the job. You will want to line your foot up with the edges of your binding and stitch straight. When you get to a corner, get as close to the corner as possible with the stitches. When you reach the corner, rotate your quilt 90 degrees so you can sew along the next section of your binding, making sure that the corner is held in place with your stitches. Once you finish off this step, you can add any decorative stitch you want on top, at any size you'd like, as the binding has already been securely stitched down and it just needs a bit of pizzazz. Here, we used a decorative cross stitch and Glamour, our 12-weight metallic thread, to add more sparkle and interest to the stitch. Here, we use Spaghetti, our 12-weight cotton thread, in a contrasting pink color, with a leaf stitch. With this method, you can be creative and play with different stitches and different threads to get a fun and unique look that matches your quilt. And there you have it, 2 different ways to add decorative stitching to any quilt. We hope this inspires you to play with the decorative stitches on your machine more and include them on your next quilting project. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more great tips, tricks, and tutorials. You can also sign up for our weekly newsletter to get the first look at free projects, sewing tips, and inspiring tutorials delivered right to your inbox. Check out the description box below to sign up, as well as find a list of stores and retailers that you can purchase Wonderfill threads from in your country.